As if it was not enough for Yemenis to suffer the unjustified murderous Saudi war and blockade against them for the past 6 years, along came Trump using his last few remaining days in office to make things even worse. US President Donald Trump's move to designate Yemen's Ansarullah movement as a foreign terrorist organization will not only disrupt peace efforts to reach a nationwide ceasefire, but also will hamper the delivery of life-saving aid in a country where fears of famine are rising thanks to Mohammed bin Salman's aerial, sea, and land blockade. Fears have grown that such a designation, which takes effect on January 19, could put both aid groups and commercial providers at risk of American legal penalties for engagement with Ansarullah, who control large swaths of Yemen, including major points of entry. Instead of responding to the drastic need for increased funding of humanitarian aid to Yemen, the Arab world's poorest country, where 80% of the population of roughly 30 million is in need of outside assistance, in large part because of Mohammed bin Salman's game of war, Trump issued a death sentence to hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of innocent people in Yemen. The war has lately turned into a disastrous quagmire for Saudi Arabia's de facto ruler, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, especially after the ground victories of Ansarullah in the northern Ma'rib governorate of Yemen. Now, with this designation, the prospects for a political settlement became remote, which, if not reversed, will prove to be a self-induced headache for Mohammed bin Salman. The designation takes effect a day before the inauguration of US President-elect Joe Biden. While he had already promised to undo or reverse many of the current administration's foreign policy actions, Biden's intentions regarding the Ansarullah designation are still unclear. However, if he takes his time in looking into this matter when taking office, it could spell death for millions of innocent Yemenis. Welcome to the Middle East Stream. I'm Marwa Osman. In his last days as US President, Donald Trump moved to designate Yemen's Ansarullah movement as a foreign terrorist organization in no apparent reason except to disrupt peace efforts in the war-torn country. This move hinders the United Nations' efforts in restarting political talks to end the Saudi-led war on Yemen. The most serious implication for this designation is the legal impediments it could create for including Ansarullah in any future talks. To discuss this issue with us from Sydney is Jay Tharapel, member of the Yemen Solidarity Council. Thank you for being with us, Jay. Now, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo announced on January 10th that the State Department will notify Congress that it has an intention to designate Ansarullah as a foreign terrorist organization. But when on earth did Ansarullah ever engage with the US or even threaten US interest anywhere?
Never. Ansarullah does not have a global agenda. They are a national resistance movement with an ideology that draws on Arab nationalism, and the ranks of their movement are comprised entirely of Yemenis. Meanwhile, according to the United States, Al-Qaeda and ISIS do have a global agenda. They have attacked the United States, and yet in Yemen, the US is on the same side as Al-Qaeda, which they admitted 2 years ago, which is why the Associated Press wrote an article that admitted that Al-Qaeda militants are effectively on the same side as the United States. That's a direct quote. The fact is that there are many in the US military that favor the Ansarullah movement in Yemen, but their voices have been completely sidelined. Again, these are not my views. These are the views of people who are close to the US military. So to quote Michael Horton from 2015, many officials at the US Special Operations Command, quote, favor the Houthis as they have been successful in rolling back Al-Qaeda. Horton then asked the question, why are we fighting a movement that's fighting Al-Qaeda? Now, these are good questions, and they're not coming from Sayyid Abdul Malik al-Houthi. They're coming from those closest to the US military. Unfortunately, there is widespread ignorance in the West about Islamic movements and this tendency to assume that they're all the same simply because they have guns and they scream Allahu Akbar. I mean, we have to differentiate between globalists and nationalists among Islamic movements around the world. I mean, on the one hand, you have al-Qaeda. It's a globalist militia. It draws on recruits from all over the world. And then you have Ansarullah. They're a nationalist movement, and they're comprised entirely of Yemenis. Their interests are confined to Yemen and the Arab world. So to answer your question, they pose no threat to the US whatsoever.
Well, if only the Americans knew that Allahu Akbar literally means hallelujah. But the US blacklisting follows a series of victories of Ansarullah, especially in the northern part of Yemen in Ma'rib province. The Saudi-led coalition has lost a lot of land. They actually lost everything in the north. Do you think that this step will affect the performance of Ansarullah militarily?
Ansarullah is the most resilient national resistance movement in the world. So much punishment has been inflicted upon them, and yet they keep taking back territories, as you mentioned, and defeating the Saudi-backed mercenaries. Having said that, the US blacklisting will certainly hurt Ansarullah by punishing its base of support in those parts of Yemen that it controls, which includes roughly 80% of Yemen's population, and that appears to be the intention. So I think if Mike Pompeo were truly honest, he'd respond by saying, yes, that is the point. US officials have warned that this designation, quote, will be a not US officials, UN officials have said this. They've said that this designation will be a death sentence to hundreds of thousands, if not millions of innocent people. Sure. 29 aid agencies have written to the US Congress expressing their concerns about this designation. And in their letter, they point out that Ansarullah are not some niche armed group with small amounts of control. They have control over 1/3 of Yemen's territory, where 80% of Yemen's population live. They are in dire need of humanitarian assistance. And that's going to be hamstrung because of these designations. And therefore, this entire war is about punishing the people of Yemen for rejecting a puppet government. Everything that comes out of Pompeo's mouth makes sense only in that context.
Well, the material support restrictions which you spoke about could create serious obstacles for outside mediators, especially those who are involved in the peace process, the ongoing attempt of peace talks between Ansarullah and other parties by making those parties involved maybe making them face criminal offense to provide maybe any property or even any services to anyone affiliated even with Ansarullah, including here we're talking about expert advice and assistance. Now, is this maybe the end, in your opinion, is it the end of any possible future peace talks between Yemen and anyone else?
Not so much, and that's because peace talks are still possible. They're still possible because, according to the US State Department, there are prescribed terrorist organizations on both sides now, regardless of whether you agree with them. So if an outside mediator objects to Ansarullah on the grounds that the US considers them to be terrorists, then they're only aiding the so-called Hadi government, which recruits directly from al-Qaeda, which is also prescribed by the US as a terrorist organization. And on top of that, Saudi Arabia supports the so-called Hadi government, which includes the Islah Party, which the Saudis themselves consider a terrorist organization because it's a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. So when you have people accusing their allies of being terrorists, why should an outside mediator take the label seriously, especially when it's coming from an outgoing administration? Furthermore, this designation speaks volumes about the divisions between, on the one hand, you have the UAE-backed Southern Transitional Council, and on the other hand, you have the Saudi-backed Hadi government, which I talked about on your show the last time I was here. Yep. Your audience would be interested to know that Pompeo issued his statement declaring Ansarullah a terrorist organization on January the 10th, which he justified by claiming that Ansarullah was responsible for the attacks carried out at Aden airport on December 30th. Exactly. Now, no evidence has been presented suggesting that Ansarullah was involved. The deputy foreign minister of the Ansarullah-backed government in Sana'a, his name's Hossein al-Ezi, he condemned the attack and he blamed it on both the UAE and Saudi Arabia. On top of that, Saudi-backed and UAE-backed forces in Yemen are accusing each other of being responsible for the attacks on Aden airport. The Southern Transitional Council has accused the Islah Party within the Hadi government of being behind the attacks. And I've seen reports from two pro-Hadi newspapers in Aden that are accusing the UAE's military attaché of being involved in the attacks. And there have been sources from within the Aden airport staff accusing the Southern Transitional Council of confiscating the airport's surveillance hardware. So my broader point is that in Aden, where the attacks happened, the accusations are flying between the Hadi government, the so-called Hadi government, and the Southern Transitional Council. But to the international media, on the same day that the attack took place, the Hadi government foreign minister blamed Ansarullah without providing any evidence, and therefore any investigation that has taken place without any evidence, and that is before any investigation had taken place. So even the former media advisor to the Hadi government, his name's Anis Mansour, he accused both the UAE and Saudi Arabia of erasing the crime scene before any investigations could be carried out. 10 days later, Mike Pompeo justified blacklisting Ansarullah on the grounds that they were responsible for these attacks. In other words, it's entirely possible that this attack was staged to justify blacklisting the Ansarullah movement. So to answer your question,
just 9 days before Pompeo hits the street.
Yeah, that's right. And it's an outgoing administration as well.
Basically, so instead of actually bringing peace to this war-torn country, the U.S. just broke off any back-channel talks between Yemen and Saudi Arabia, for that matter, if it were to happen, to reach a nationwide ceasefire. If the US's move was aimed at pushing Ansarullah away from what they call is the Iranian influence or the Iranian axis, what do you think will happen now?
Well, let's judge what the US is thinking by the consequences of their actions. Every ship that delivers anything to Yemen is already extensively searched for weapons, and they're specifically looking for Iranian weapons. Now, there's the possibility that aid agencies could be prosecuted by the US government for simply sending aid to the starving people of Yemen, simply because the government in Sana'a is aligned with Ansarullah. Therefore, the only logical conclusion to be drawn from the blacklisting of Ansarullah is that the only strategy that the US-Saudi alliance have is the weaponization of mass starvation against the Yemeni people. But as I mentioned earlier, the US is allied with Al-Qaeda in Yemen, which perhaps explains why 2 days after blacklisting Ansarullah, Pompeo announced that Iran and Al-Qaeda had formed this so-called axis.
He's just throwing accusations left and right. Yeah. And to be honest with you, what you're saying is just 101 colonialism. And I wish we had more time, but I promise that we will talk more about this in upcoming episodes. I want to thank you very much, Jay Therapel, member of the Yemen Solidarity Council, for joining us from Sydney at such a late hour. I want to thank you very much